or try to do both, raise children and have a full career, but there is somewhat of a trade-off. You can't be working completely full-time and raising children full-time without, let's say, maybe bringing a nanny or some other help and some other labor into this kind of process. But there is somewhat of a trade-off. And if you graph, let's say, the percentage of women who are working at different ages, this is what demographers call an M curve. And let me explain why it's called an M curve. Because as women enter childbearing age, for let's say the entire population, this is not every single woman, but this is the general pattern. As women enter childbearing ages, basically mid-20s to their mid-30s, fewer women work. They drop out or they leave the workforce, at least temporarily. And this might be for 9 months, it might be for a year, it might be for 5 or 10 years. But more and more women are leaving, let's say, the workforce and focusing on raising children or childbearing. And so if we look at a graph of different countries, we can see this pattern in a lot of different countries. So let me just isolate two. So this is the United States. So for women age 15 to 19, as you can see, the numbers, their participation in the workforce, they go from half of them participating in the workforce to about 80% by the early 20s, and roughly from their mid-20s to their 30s, 35, you can see that little kink. It kind of goes down. They have their children, they raise their children, and then their participation goes up. So older women are returning to the workforce after raising their children, okay, and it goes up roughly to, their 50s, 60s, and it declines kind of gradually over time till about age 65, 70, and then of course they retire and they leave the workforce. Now let me show you another country. This is Japan. So this red line shows you Japan. So initially you have kind of the same pattern. Women go from 20, 30, 40% in the workforce in their teenage years. By the time they hit their 20s, it looks just like the United States. But what you notice here is the kink is a lot larger. They leave the workforce in a much bigger way than American women do. And they have this phenomenon in Japan called kyoku mama, means education mother. So when women have children, it's expected. And it used to be legal to fire women once they got married or had children because they were supposed to focus on raising their children. And kyoku mamas, let me explain a little bit more, is that mothers are supposed to be basically education tutors for their children. They're supposed to invest in their children, not in working and, let's say, bringing an income into the household. And so they stay, more women leave, and also they stay out a lot longer than American women. But by the age of 45, 49, you can see that women have more or less returned to the same level as American women, and then over their older years they drop out. Now the other lines here show you a few other countries. If you looked at less developed countries or more traditional societies like Malaysia and Singapore, you can see that a lot fewer women are actually participating in the workforce, meaning they're not going out and getting jobs, they're spending most of their time in the household. And so you see a much more dramatic, almost not an M curve, you see an increase, and unlike Japanese or American women, they never return to the workforce. They have their children and they stay out of the workforce. And if you compare to some Northern European countries like Germany and Denmark, these two lines here at the top, you can see that women reach very, very high rates of participation. In Germany, you have almost 95, 97% of the women working, and they almost never leave. Now, the thing is this kind of tells you something about the birth rate. In Germany and Denmark, women are not having children. They're having one child perhaps per woman, not two, which just means their population is actually decreasing because women aren't having enough children to keep the population at its current level. In between, you have countries like the United States and Japan, but in traditional societies, women are focusing having children, and they have birth rates of, let's say, 3, 4, 5 births per adult childbearing age woman. So what happens, obviously, in Malaysia and Singapore, the population's growing because they're having a lot more children because they're opting to, let's say, have children instead of work. But in developed countries, women are opting increasingly for work over, let's say, raising children. You can see this also over time, and this shows you the M curves for the United States from about 1890 to the late 1990s. And so in 1890 you can see only about 20% of the women went into the population. It went up in their early 20s, then dropped off. Looks a lot like Malaysia or Singapore. By the 1950s you can kind of start to see an M pattern, right? Women 20% up to 40%, in their mid-20s dropping down to maybe 30%, kind of a rebound in their 30s, 40s, and then a tailing off. In the 70s you see the same thing. Basically it goes up, then it comes down in the childbearing ages, then goes back up again, and finally down as they reach retirement. By 1996, the United States looks a lot like Germany, which means that women enter the workforce, stay in the workforce, have fewer children, okay, and really there's even no kink anymore. The M has disappeared, and all you have is kind of an upside down U. Women enter the workforce, they look just like men basically. They enter the workforce, they stay in the workforce, and then when they retire, they drop out of the workforce. There's no kind of, let's say, mid-career dropout to go and raise children. Now a lot of this is what women are doing, is they're hiring other women to be domestics, to be au pairs, to be hiring other women to be full-time, let's say, raising children, and use that as their income rather than raising their own children themselves. So let's go to another issue to kind of look at this. And this is, as I said before, a little bit about the sex ratio. Now the sex ratio is how many women or how many men there are compared to women. And this kind of helps determine the marriage market, right? If there's just as many women as men, the marriage market or the dating market, and we'll just presume simple heterosexual relationships for this. I realize there's other things in here, but let's just keep this simple for right now. That the sex ratio is the balance of women to men and men to women. And the market is balanced if there's just as many women as there are men. Think of that, let's say, Snoopy Peanuts example. If there's just as many guys showing up as girls, everyone leaves the date, everyone's happy, everyone gets married, tra-la-la-la-la. But what happens actually is that it's not actually balanced, and there's actually a different balance if you compare developing societies with developed societies. In poor countries, let me start, one by one. Biologically, if women and men have exactly the same chances and exactly the same resources and exactly the same nutrition and diet, there should be more women than men. Men are biologically superior. Part of this is that they're much less likely to have congenital problems, which means that they're much less likely to die before age 5 if women are born. There's something about having a body designed to go through childbirth, which makes you a little hardier. And women also tend to do a lot of things that make them healthier over their lifespan, such as seeing doctors, arguably a little bit less stress by not participating as much historically in the workforce. But, and as a result, they have slightly longer life expectancies, which means in a normal, unbiased society where there's gender equality, there should be more women than men. However, in poor societies, there are pretty consistently more men than women. Now, why is that? A lot of this has to do with what happens in poor societies is that, first of all, the men get the food first, because they're the producers, they're the ones who go out in the field and raise the, work in a job or grow the food. And what happens in poor countries is, and many people have studied this, including the Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen, is that if there's only so much food to go around, the men get the first portions and the women get whatever's left over. And as a result, women tend to be undernourished, and therefore women tend to die at a much higher rate than men in these societies. Add into, garden variety, gender discrimination, sex selection at birth, a preference for boys over girls, and not surprisingly, you have more men in the society as a total than women. But in rich countries, there's always almost more women than men. Partially this is because women have more equal opportunities, they're able to achieve their biological advantage, and as a result, there tends to be slightly more women in society than men. So we have two situations. The first one is where women are scarce, which means when the sex ratio is more than one and there's more, let's say, men than women in society. So this would be typical of a poor developing country. You have a high sex ratio or a sex ratio over 1. Now, women are scarce, which means their price is going to be high. And there was a great and very interesting book called Too Many Women by two sociologists. And they kind of looked at what happens when the sex ratio changes, how do women get treated differently. And they said that when the sex ratio is high, women are treated as precious objects. They're scarce. They're treated as property. This kind of would be a characterization of women in the Middle East and other countries where women have relatively low social status. The idea of a veil is that women are property and women are scarce, and if I have a wife or a daughter, or more so a wife than daughters, but if I have a wife, then I'm going to put her in a veil so that I can consume her and whatever her charms are, and you can't. So they're treated kind of like a precious object, and we kind of restrict access, and we insist on only us being able to consume whatever those qualities are. But you also tend to have a high emphasis on romance and chivalry, this idea of honor, that women are prized, that women have to be wooed. And if we think historically in Western societies, this idea of gentlemen callers, how was dating organized in, let's say, most earlier societies, was that we tend to think that, well, men had all the cards and the women were, kind of the lesser sex in some ways. But in fact, what would happen is that women could sit at home, and that if you're interested in dating such and such woman, you would go to her house and you would be a gentleman caller. And they would come and bring you presents and chocolates and flowers, and they would have to ask your father permission to be an official suitor. And then you got to choose whichever these gentlemen you favored the most. Your father might make a few suggestions, but basically women held all the cards. They made the decision, at least about who they got to be married. On top of that, you tend to get societies where virginity and chastity are high values placed on these the idea of purity. And a lot of this is that, well, this is kind of a precious object. You don't want used goods, and therefore if someone else has dated or kissed or had sex with this woman, then they're basically not as valuable as they were before. And this goes back to this idea of women being precious objects because they're relatively scarce compared to the number of men in that society. So the study Too Many Women then looked at what happens when women are plentiful, when you have more women than men, so when the sex ratio is less than 1. What people said, and this is what happens in modern societies, is that the price or the value of women becomes low. Women become cheap. And what you see is the marriage market shifts from favoring women to favoring men. Men, there's lots of fish in the sea. There's more women, so if one turns you down, you can just always go try to find another one, because there are fewer men than there are women, and therefore there's some women who are going to be left out, and they're not going to find suitable gentlemen suitors. And so men can basically treat women worse. I don't have to go and open doors for you, or bring you flowers, or woo you, or let's say do all the things that traditionally we expect men to do when they're dating or courting women. And what you tend to have is that men say, well, I can cheat.